As we're welcoming you to Cal, I'd like to start off by discussing your educational background and personal college experience. You went to a tight-knit boarding school in New Hampshire and then to the University of Virginia with a student population of over 15,000. How did your high school experience influence your expectations of college life?
Yeah, so I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina. Had an older brother who stayed in Charlotte kind of through high school and had an awesome experience. And so it was definitely a tough decision going to boarding school. It was something that I wasn't sure growing up if I wanted to do. My dad had gone to boarding school in Virginia, and so I definitely thought about it. And then as it got closer to high school, I just realized there were some really cool opportunities. And it was kind of neat to be able to live in a dorm with your friends and have that experience. The New England winter was probably a little worse than the winter in Charlotte, and so there were definitely some downsides, but it was something that, I was lucky enough to be in a family that, I could take that risk, and they would kind of support me to do that. And so did high school in New Hampshire, made a lot of really good friends. I think that it's a really unique high school experience. We had class on Saturdays. Again, you're in a building with 30 other guys your age, and so by the time you get to college, in some ways you're really prepared, and then in other ways, you're kind of not prepared at all because you think you have it all under control and you've lived in a dorm, but a college dorm is very different than a high school dorm. And so I'd say overall, it felt like in some ways, I had people who went to day school looking to me, and it was kind of the blind leading the blind, but definitely wouldn't do it any other way. And certainly from a geographic perspective, it was really cool to grow up in Charlotte, go to high school in New Hampshire, and then kind of end up back in the middle, going to UVA.
One of the most important aspects of the university experience and the high school experience is the relationships that you build with your peers. Could you share a little bit about how those social connections you built in college influence both your academic journey and your personal growth?
Yeah, definitely. I think I've been really lucky all along to just have some really strong friendships and more importantly, just realize the importance of different people and different kind of interpersonal connections. And I think, as you pointed out, that starts in high school. It also continues through college. And I think that it really begins possibly earlier, thinking about your family and just those really tight-knit, strong bonds. And so, in some ways, not to jump ahead, but as you think about why DoorList was created, it really was about bringing people together and trying to facilitate those interactions post-COVID as people had been so split up. And so it kind of came full circle in a lot of ways. I don't know, probably would have done it anyway, even if I hadn't gone to boarding school, even hadn't gone to UVA specifically. But it all kind of came together pretty perfectly as I was kind of finishing up my time at UVA.
You mentioned how important that kind of family structure is, and one kind of offshoot of that is the Brotherhood of Fraternity. As a member of UVA's DKE chapter with its network of influential alumni, how did you tap into those connections to support your career?
Yeah, it was a tough decision if I wanted to join a fraternity, just because I was also involved in athletics at UVA, and so they've definitely pulled in a lot of directions. A lot of teams didn't even let you join a fraternity, and that was something, you couldn't be in Greek life. Our coach allowed it to happen, but it was definitely a different type of membership than probably a lot of my friends who didn't play sports. And so, we didn't do social members, we didn't do anything like that, but in some ways it felt like that. I couldn't go out on Thursday, Fridays because we had a game Saturday. And then maybe by Saturday night, a lot of them were in for the night, but we were excited to go hang out with our friends. And so honestly, sports in some ways pull you out of the social scene a little bit, and for me, a fraternity was really valuable in that it would kind of keep me grounded and make sure I had friends who weren't in athletics. And so that's honestly why I did it in the first place. I loved my teammates, but I didn't want to graduate with 30 friends who were all from Baltimore and Long Island, and we're all sort of lacrosse players. And so it was great for me to join a fraternity that was primarily non-athletes. And so now when I look back, I have a ton of athlete friends and a ton of non-athlete friends, and I think that's partially because I chose to do the Greek life path. There's a lot of ways to get that. I think clubs can do that, just putting yourself out there. But for me, it was a really straightforward path to ensuring I got a pretty well-rounded college experience.
Trying to maintain a well-rounded college experience can take a lot of time and energy, and you kept pretty busy in college doing a double major in business and computer science, being a student athlete, being in a fraternity, and also trying to build an app at the same time. How did you end up balancing the challenges of startup life and entrepreneurship while juggling student life as well?
Yeah, the reality was it just meant that we moved a little bit slower on the startup side than we probably could have. There just weren't enough hours in the day. I would say I was pulled at any given point by what I was kind of most interested in. And obviously, some things you don't have a choice about. You gotta get your homework done so you don't flunk out. You gotta go to practice, so you don't get kicked off the team. And so you don't always have choice. But in a lot of ways, I think that I didn't go into UVA thinking, I'm going to do computer science. I'd never actually coded before college. But I was just super interested in it and really liked the first couple classes I'd taken. I realized it was kind of the first class that I'd ever looked forward to doing the homework and really enjoyed doing it. So I thought, I'm actually going to let myself get pulled in that direction, and then kind of noticed this social problem that I wanted to solve, and so tried to make a mobile app to solve it, and suddenly, was working on a startup, and then came in playing lacrosse and also wanting to do the undergrad business thing. And so it wasn't a decision I made at the outset, and it was at times hard to balance, but I think that, I never felt burnt out because I was really passionate about all the different things, and I was able to adjust. And so there were weeks where I, wouldn't touch DoorList, and then other weeks where fortunately we'd have an off week from lacrosse. And so it made it possible. In hindsight, again, though, could we be a little further along today? If I hadn't been doing all those things, maybe. But I think my experience wouldn't have been as good, and so I wouldn't change a ton looking back.
Expanding on your development of DoorList, you mentioned in an X post that you initially started it as a side project without huge expectations. As you've been able to take it full time and as the app has grown in popularity, how has your priorities shifted regarding your future career and DoorList's future?
Yeah, when I first launched DoorList, no part of me thought I would ever do it full time as a job. It just didn't seem like something that could be a job. It didn't seem like a business. It was an app I had made. It also was very small, and candidly, I didn't think that people would be willing to use their phone to go to events and go to parties. It just felt like that was a big ask, and a lot of them were just fine with the status quo. It frustrated me enough seeing the problem that I wanted to try to solve it, but it wasn't lost to me. I think there's some stats, 90+% of apps on the App Store never get more than 1,000 downloads. So in a lot of ways, it was more just a challenge to myself to try to create something. As traction grew, and we started to see people were using it in some really novel and exciting ways, I started to think about, okay, maybe this is a career. It happened really organically, though. I didn't wake up one day and say, you know what, I was going to do consulting. Instead of doing consulting, I'm going to go do DoorList. It was actually much more gradual. And so at first, I delayed the start of the job I had signed for in Boston by a couple months, and then by a year, and then I called them and said, actually, I wouldn't be coming back at all. And so I was able to kind of de-risk it personally, and as the company grew, as we had more and more traction, I think my passion for it grew, my focus for it grew, and it kind of worked out timing-wise perfectly, so I didn't need to drop out or didn't need to do anything, some of my peers, other startups have had to do just because their startups take off a little bit earlier in college. So I was able to sneak out with a diploma, have an awesome 4 years, and then really hit the ground running in May of 2023, right after graduating, working on DoorList full-time.
As DoorList had kind of a gradual beginning, you had a little bit of extra time to learn ropes. And managing the startup can take a lot of hands-on knowledge that you only gain on the job. Looking back, what kinds of learned skills from your past education or early startup journey helped you most from running your company?
Yeah, so specifically things learned post-launch or leading up, before DoorList even existed?
Leading up.
Yeah, I think UVA did a really good job of having a pretty broad curriculum. It was amazing the number of times as we were developing DoorList in the early days that something from one of, my business classes would actually come into play. And I would think, even on the technical side, because they did a really good job of it. It didn't feel like it was a finance degree. And my computer science degree actually was pretty well-rounded too. We built projects that were applicable to other sectors. And so I actually felt remarkably well prepared by the curriculum at UVA, which I think not everyone feels that way in college. There's some people who think, it's a credential, and then separately you have to learn all these skills. I think definitely learned a ton from that. And then the other thing is and I think I've learned this more and more, is the internet is such a valuable teacher for these things, and so many people have done whatever you're trying to do. And so I very quickly learned that, it was worth taking 30 minutes to watch a tutorial or to read a couple articles instead of just diving in actually. And it feels a little slower, but it really pays dividends. And so we definitely made a lot of mistakes in the early days. Rohan was one of our interns, and some of his job was cleaning up some of those early mistakes. And seeing that, but that was okay. In the early days, it wasn't about the app being perfect or being able to scale to millions of users. We were at one school, and so it really just needed to validate some early hypotheses.
Because of your classes and the teachers you were with, did you ever turn to any of them for mentorship?
Yeah, absolutely. So UVA had the undergrad business school. It's called McIntyre. I think Berkeley is a similar undergrad business school. And teachers have different disciplines. So we had a marketing class, and then we had a IT class, and then a finance class. And I would actually go to each of the teachers for different things. And so as we were modeling out different financial projections when we started to raise money, I'd go to my finance teacher. Certainly would go to the marketing teacher about, how do we message this? And so it really was a team effort. There were so many people willing to give back. I'm really grateful for, and honestly have kept in touch with really well. And that's been something I wouldn't have expected. I think I kind of assumed in college, there'd be hundreds of people in class, and you graduate, get your diploma, and maybe not keep up with the teachers. I've been amazed how much I've kept up with different faculty because they were so helpful and so formative through that whole experience.
Expanding on some of those business building resources from undergraduate time, while you were a student, you won $5,000 from the UVA Entrepreneurship Cup to work on DoorList. How did the collegiate atmosphere of your university with both Greek life and university resources affect the trajectory of DoorList?
Yeah, it was really the perfect place to launch. I think, DoorList is not a novel idea. I think that it is actually a pretty cliche idea, and it's something that I think a lot of people have been sitting around on the couch with their friends, and said, oh, it'd be nice if there's an app to do whatever, and the DoorList or some variant of it is actually a pretty common one. A lot of them, they don't build it in the first place, or they build and it flames out pretty quickly. UVA had some really specific characteristics that made it a great spot to launch. I think socially, groups hang out with other groups, and that is just a built-in growth mechanic. And so immediately, you onboard one group, they invite 3 other groups to their events, they each invite 3, and so we saw pretty viral growth immediately at UVA. Not every school's like that. Berkeley actually shows a little bit of that, which is why we've grown pretty strong here. There's other schools where groups feel really siloed. It's okay, we figured out ways to grow at those siloed schools. It'd be really hard if it was our first school, because it takes a lot of effort, and I think it'd be really discouraging, and we wouldn't have a school like UVA to point to as the end goal. And so I'm really grateful that I went there. I also think it's part of the reason that I noticed the problem enough to want to try to solve it, is that it was so prevalent at UVA. A very consistent social schedule, students who love interacting with each other and just in general are pretty social. And so it truly was, it's funny, until this school year, UVA was still our top school, partially because we had launched there first. Berkeley is actually now our top school by most metrics, which is pretty cool. But for the longest time, it was UVA, and it wasn't just because of the early launch, it was because it was just a really kind of tailored for the way the school worked.
You mentioned some of the difficulties of expanding across schools, unlike UVA or Berkeley. Can you share some of the strategies that you worked on to kind of expand and grow?
Yeah, it's one of the tough things. You don't want to build an app for every different school. It's not a scalable approach. But you also, if something's not working, if something's only working at 10% of schools, you do need to change it. And so that's the push and pull. We actually have a pretty good idea of the social app that will work at any given campus. You ask a couple questions, and it's pretty obvious, okay, this would be the app that would grow by, and we've gotten good at that. We've figured out the right way to grow things quickly and how to market it and the right students to start with. And so if you just said, pick a school, build an app from scratch, we actually are pretty confident. We've done little experiments, versions on small scale of this, that we could grow it. But the challenge is, can you do that with putting schools into buckets where you don't end up with more than 3 or 4 buckets? Because you can actually build a mobile app that has kind of 3 or 4 key variants without diluting kind of the core value prop. You can't go much more than that. And even 3 or 4 is a lot. You have to be really careful. It's why we hired a designer pretty early to figure out how to manage that. And so, it really does depend on the school. And there also, the other thing I'll add is there are schools where we just are fundamentally not a fit. Certainly schools in cities, we have not seen strong fit. Big cities, we're not big at Columbia, we're not big at NYU. Schools where the social scene mainly revolves around just going to a certain bar. DoorList is not really a bar app. It's much more of a social app, and those places tend to be constrained more by, can you get in, and are you over 21, and it's just a very different social scene. I think there's actually a big opportunity to build in that space. It's just not the space we're in. And so one thing is we've just been really okay with that. We don't need to be at 100% of schools yet. And so we're actually really okay to kind of let a school to pasture and say, what, that's all right. We're not going to grow there yet. It would be a massive energy suck, massive amount of time. The last thing I'll say is what surprised us, though, is the spread of schools where we are applicable. We have schools with fewer than 2,500 students where we have a really high capture rate, and then we have huge schools where we also have a high capture rate and really exciting usage patterns. And in some ways, they use it in the same way, just on a much smaller scale at the smaller schools. And so that's been really cool to see. Geography really doesn't matter. We have actually more users on the West Coast than the East Coast, depending on kind of where you draw that line. And so it's been cool to see kind of how widely applicable it is, and it's one of the reasons that we've been pretty successful in the past few years.
Thinking about a lot of the research that you've done to kind of develop these models, it's clear that you've been able to have some really important mentorship throughout the process, even outside of school and UVA. And DoorList was selected for the prestigious Neo Accelerator program, a significant achievement for any market startup. How crucial do you see mentorship and venture capital when determining any startup success in today's competitive landscape?
Yeah, I would separate them. I would say mentorship is extremely important. Venture capital, it depends. We're certainly in a business where monetization primarily comes at scale, and so you do need to raise some money up front to get to that scale. There's a lot of really great businesses, candidly, in some cases better businesses, that do not have to raise venture capital. And that's a specific phrasing of have to raise venture capital. There's sort of a tongue-in-cheek tweet I saw that's anytime someone announces a fundraise, the only appropriate response is, "I'm sorry for your loss," because you are giving away a part of the company. And so, I would say VC, it really depends on the company, but to focus on mentorship, it was really critical for me. I was kind of an outsider to the whole startup tech scene. It wasn't something I thought that I would do. And so for me, having people who had done it before, you mentioned Neo, that was such a massive thing for us to be involved. Not just because of the Neo team. I was actually at the Neo office earlier this afternoon. We're still so close with that entire team, obviously. But it's also the other 20 startups in the accelerator. And those are some really good friends of mine. I was actually at a basketball game last night in New York with 2 other founders from our batch, and we've really kept up. And so I would say that it's not just mentorship from people who are older, it's also from peers. And we try to hopefully give back to the Neo community as well. But there are people I talk to all the time where I think, wow, you know so much more today, than I'll probably even know in a year. You're just 19, you're so kind of in the space. You grew up in Silicon Valley, and we're always reading things about startups and 0 to 1 and all of it. That really wasn't me. I was passionate about solving a pretty specific social issue, built a mobile app to do it, and then suddenly kind of ended up in this world. And so it was great to have some guiding forces. Neo is a huge one. We have other awesome investors, and then we also have people who aren't investors but have just really generously given their time.
As you've graduated quite recently, you're still a pretty young founder yourself, but you mentioned kind of giving back to the Neo program. What does that look like for you? Yeah,
so Neo has a really cool program called the Neo Scholars. They pick 30-ish of the highest achieving CS undergrads in the country who have indicated that they want to work at startups. It is an incredible group. They also have finalists, which is 100 or so, who are also incredible. I don't know how they managed to ever whittle it down. And so definitely love working with the Neo Scholars. Transparently, it's because we hope to hire a lot of them, and so really want to selfishly build those relationships. But also, the Neo Accelerator happens every year, and so they're accepting a batch right now. If anyone is in the startup world, I actually really encourage you to apply. But there was a batch last year as well below us, and we would talk to them all the time because we had raised money post-demo day and could tell them what that looked like. And so there are a lot of opportunities to be able to give back, and Neo makes it really easy because of this kind of cyclical once-a-year model, both with the scholars and the accelerator.
Going back a bit to your market strategy, you previously touched on how there are a lot of different apps that compete with DoorList for kind of engagement, and apps like Eventbrite or Particle, which can sometimes capture a similar demographic. What key factors set apart your app, and how have you worked to kind of give DoorList an individual identity? Yeah,
it's such a good question. We really launched as a pure play ticketing app. And that was all I thought it would be. I mean, it opened to a QR code. It was clearly this is a ticketing app. We launched, and our app store category was utilities. And that's all it seemed like. It really quickly became clear that people were using it much more in a social way than in a ticketing way. And the stats on that were obvious. We saw 90+% of daily active users weren't scanning into events. We saw 500-person events that didn't record a single scan, but yet tons of the guests opened the app. And so it was clear it was much more of a social platform than ticketing. And so that quickly ruled out, we had no identity crisis between Eventbrite or Ticketmaster. That wasn't the space we were in. The two features that really helped us grow were plus ones. So we were replacing in a lot of cases paper wristbands, and so a lot of our events used to distribute paper wristbands, and so I would have 3, 1 for me and 2 for my friends. And plus ones were kind of a digital equivalent of that, where instead of handing a wristband, you could just from your phone invite someone. It makes it really easy. It's also just a really great growth hack because you're inviting more people to the app in process of inviting them to the event. So they also become users in addition to guests. The other one was being able to invite entire groups, and by extension, even give entire groups plus ones. Both of those features, A, just fit really well into the college social scene. That's how college events tend to work. But B, helped us grow really quickly because, as you can see, for the same reasons they're really helpful for these events, they're really helpful for growing an app, especially in the early days. And those are features we honestly haven't seen emulated on almost any platform still. There's versions of them, on Partyful, you can indicate that you have a +2 and come with 2 other people. There's not as much of an access control mechanism, so if you want to scan people in, they don't do ticketing as much. There's little versions of it, and I'm sure more will come because it clearly works pretty well. But it's actually been surprising because those 2 things sort of stand alone as the 2 features why we took off in the early days and why we've kind of been able to continue to grow.
As DoorList navigates that same competitive event management space, it also taps into kind of a larger trend of how technology is changing social dynamics. In a college campus culture that's often characterized by those spontaneous face-to-face interactions, technology-based platforms such as Bumble and DoorList are reshaping how students can meet and interact with each other, even behind social events. What lasting impact do you think this could have on campus life?
Yeah, it's something that at first we weren't thinking about at all. And we were just trying to solve this problem, and it didn't even cross my mind. Lasting impact felt so. I just hoped somebody used it after the day I graduated. I knew I had a year left, and I was like, hopefully they're not just using this to be nice to me, but hopefully it's actually solving a problem. There's been some really cool data that we can look at because a lot of these events, they used to order wristbands or they used to have a big spreadsheet. We can actually look at the size of events and the composition of events before DoorList and after. And it's really, really interesting. Events have gotten notably larger, notably actually more inclusive. It's something that it feels a little backwards. It's like we're using an app now. Doesn't that make it more exclusive? But we make it so easy to invite entire groups. We encourage you to give +1s. We do push notifications to remind you to invite more people. And so actually events grow. Events have more people on the list, and that's a really good thing. There's also, I think, a social impact of the way that access control at events used to happen often got really problematic. You had someone at the door just kind of eyeballing it and saying, yes to you, no to you. We've made that really objective. Walking in, whether you're on the list or not, it makes it super obvious. Hopefully you are, but if you aren't, you're not sort of holding your breath, hoping whatever spreadsheet they have says your name. Somebody can't just be a jerk and just decide for some reason to not let you in. And so we feel like we've definitely made the actual entry process a lot more seamless. And then also there's just something to be said for the visibility of these social gatherings. College is like a tricky spot socially for almost everyone. And everyone has different reasons that it's difficult. But in general, bringing these gatherings out to the open like we have, you can see what your friends are up to. Even if you're not invited, just having that awareness of it, I think, is a really positive thing. A lot of these events used to happen in the darkness, kind of across the board. We've really brought them into the light, and I think that it's unanimously been something that students have recognized as just a really positive shift.
You mentioned in joke, but your friends using the app to help you out. Did you have any moments of having people take a leap of faith on you and using your app, not necessarily knowing how it would impact their events?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I joke. The app was so bad when we first launched it. It really was. It was not ready to be on the App Store. It's probably good that we launched early. They always say you should be embarrassed about your first product and you learn a bunch. The only reason that we had our first event on DoorList was that it was the organization I was in. And so my 2 friends were the social chairs, and we're sort of like, all right, fine, we will use this. Then it immediately kind of took off from there. It really just took one, but that initial event would have been really, really difficult if I hadn't been in that organization or if they had just said outright no. And so that leap of faith was huge. I think that we've gotten the product to a spot where we're not asking new schools anymore to take a leap of faith. We wanted to pitch it more as a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you be using this? But in the early days, I think that every 5th time you open the app, it would crash. If you didn't have a great internet connection, it would log you out right as you were trying to scan it. There were all these reasons. It was a really bad user experience. It counterintuitively was a pretty good signal that we were onto something, though, that people continued to use it despite that jank. It's very obvious that you're solving a problem if people continue to use your product, even though it's not a great experience. It means something else is overriding that. And so once we ironed those things out in the few months after launch, since then it's been pretty smooth sailing, and it doesn't feel as much of a leap of faith.
How did you navigate ironing out some of those bugs in the early days when you were not still sure of its future kind of impact?
Yeah, it's one of the benefits of building a college app while you're in college is I was in really close proximity to our users. And at that point, we were just at UVA. I think we grew to 1 or 2 more schools in that first semester. And so I was near almost all the users. I was going to events in many cases. And so I would see the problems firsthand. People would text me about the problems. And we didn't do a great job of analytics tracking. There's all these tools we have now about I get a text message if suddenly our APIs take longer than 3 seconds to repopulate. And there's all these things that we have. We didn't have any of that. We didn't do any sort of error logging. So you just kind of wait and hear about it. And so it definitely meant that we probably didn't fix all the bugs as quickly as we could have. I was frankly learning what it looked like to build production software. It's very different to build software for yourself than for thousands of people. And that was something that took me a little bit to learn, and then you kind of learn it all at once, what that actually looks like.
Turning to kind of a more serious issue regarding nightlife, you touched a little bit about the exclusivity that Greek life can promote and how DoorList seeks to kind of break down those toxic barriers and remove those flaws. Was that an initial goal, do you think, besides trying to get rid of paper wristbands to trying to grow the space?
Yeah, frankly, it wasn't an initial goal. It was not, I think if I thought back to what I was thinking, it wasn't about making events either more exclusive or more inclusive. That was sort of out of the picture. It was that you had to have some sort of system of, the supply and demand did not line up. The houses were not big enough for the number of people who would probably like to be at any given event. And so there had to be some sort of access control, and the way we were doing it was just terrible. Whether it's fumbling through pieces of paper, showing a text message, paper wristbands that could fall off, you throw them on the ground, that system seemed terrible. So I just wanted to digitize the paper wristband. I didn't want to build a social platform, didn't even think of it as a startup. That is all I was trying to solve. It turned out that a really cool side effect of digitizing the paper wristband is that so many things in the social life ecosystem got a lot better simultaneously. But it wasn't part of the initial goal. It was kind of a happy accident, and I think this wouldn't work if that hadn't been the case, but it was in some ways kind of lucky. In a lot of ways, the reasons that we have grown, that I've pointed out, also end up being really useful social features, because in the same way events want to have a lot of people there, we want to have a lot of users. In the same way as events want to be engaging, we want the app to be engaging. Our interests are often aligned, and so by building features that are really, really powerful for guests and hosts, we build things that are really, really retentive for the app. And so it's made it, we don't have to there's no dilemmas, which is really nice.
You mentioned a lot of the advice and kind of on-the-fly learning that you got from friends and brothers, everyone using your app. Did you find any parallels between being on a sports team and having collaboration in that sense? Definitely.
I think that in a sports team, there's a little bit more shared responsibility. I would say the biggest thing, so I played goalie on the lacrosse team, and a great goalie, a Hall of Fame goalie in college, has about a 60% save percentage, which means that they're failing 40% of the time. They're letting the ball in. Sometimes it's their fault, sometimes it's not. But the very best, and I was much below that. And so I was really okay with failure. And I think that building software, specifically consumer software, is a lot about trying things and iterating. And we have been wrong dramatically more times than we've been right. We have tried so many features that, all you guys seem to have no interest in, and that's okay. And I think it's a little bit of kind of that, goalie mentality of that's fine, we'll wait for the next shot and try to save it. And it's okay to fail half the time as long as you're really succeeding on the ones and you're really doubling down on what is working. And so that's the biggest parallel I notice right away. I think some people are so afraid of failure. They're so afraid of investing time and energy into a feature that doesn't quite take off. I was just never afraid of that. For me, it was just, it was just the same as when some guy winds up and shoots and you let the ball in and you just try again the next time. And so I think that probably helped us even more than I realized at the time, and certainly looking back.
Looking more towards the future, with what you just said about trying new kinds of apps, app features. In UVA Today interview, you said that you hope to expand DoorList beyond universities into general nightlife, fantasy spaces, or comedy clubs. How do you see or plan to pursue this vision in the next few years?
Yeah, and a lot of things have changed since that interview, I think. I think in that interview, and this was when I was in college, we were still trying to figure out what the business actually was. It was not totally clear. People seemed to like using the app, but it was an app, not a company. And so I used to think that the only way to make it work was to, as quickly as possible, get out of college. It just felt like college was too small. As we've unlocked new forms of engagement and new types of events and really democratized what an event even is on DoorList, I think that we've realized we are not in as fast of a rush to get out of college. We've actually in some ways doubled down on college. And so the app used to ask you for your phone number and name. Now it asks phone number, name, school, grad year. Really a feature putting to the forefront. Our app used to be called DoorList on the App Store. Now it's DoorList-college events. And so we've really actually tried to go the opposite direction. This is purpose-built for this demographic, and we feel like there's a ton of white space here. Now, eventually, do we think this could be a platform where everyone, college or not, manages their social calendar, sees what their friends are up to, invites people? Absolutely. But for now, we're just myopically focused on college and trying to figure out how to solve the problems of this demographic, because it's a really exciting, dynamic demographic to be solving for.
The theme of kind of taking things slow and making sure that you're doing everything with purpose has come up a few times, and you just made a distinction between an app and a company. Can you expand on how you go from app to company and what the big differences are?
Yeah, it's a question we're still trying to answer as well. And I think every kind of late seed stage startup is also trying to figure out. In my mind, I've always, before I was kind of in the startup world, thought, a company should probably make more money than it spends. We spend more money than we make. So by my old definition, we would not be a company. I've realized that that's probably a little narrow. I think Uber took, a decade to turn any sort of profit. And so there is an expectation of upfront investment. I think in general, there are a lot of great companies that are built around a core app. There's a lot of great companies that have a lot of small apps. Everything is a little bit different. It felt like an app when we were solving one problem, and that was just you scan into an event, you put it in your pocket, you think about it the next week on Thursday. It wasn't that we then launched 20 new products and suddenly in the aggregate it was a company. It was much more when we looked at the fact, okay, wait, people are actually using this on Monday, Tuesday now. We're seeing, events on Wednesdays, not just Friday, Saturday. It went from the typical DoorList user was using DoorList something like 1.5 times per week to we got up to like 3.8, 3.9 days of the week. So like almost the majority actually. And in certain cohorts, we got above 4. And for me that, I always thought best case we were 2-day-a-week app, Friday, Saturday. Then we got to the majority of the weekdays. And so those are the type of signals where you start to think, okay, wait a sec, like this is actually kind of a business. Certainly as you raise money, you actually literally incorporate as a company, but it's also just a mindset shift. Am I trying to build an app to solve a very niche problem, or am I trying to build something that actually could be transformational in certain sects? And that transition happened gradually. We didn't wake up one day and say, today it's a company. But I'd say by the time I graduated from UVA, it was very clear that the trends we were seeing, it was just different. And it was certainly worth pursuing. And we have a team that's really, really passionate about trying to solve that problem. And I think that it brings energy to everybody.
You mentioned waiting for signals and being okay to fail. But along that line, do you have any words of advice for future founders themselves?
Yeah, I would say, the cost of building software, the speed to build things has never been faster. You can get an MVP out so quickly. And so I make this point a lot. You talk to a lot of people who spend so much time in the pre-planning stage and building business plans and thinking through what does it look like at Series B and beyond before they've built the initial product. And I just always encourage people to build things that you're interested in and try to solve problems for yourself. And see where it goes. And if it ends up being in a spot where it makes sense to go raise some money or start charging people and making money that way, that's awesome. And if it doesn't, you'll still have learned a ton. But you don't want to spin your wheels sort of playing the game of, I'm an entrepreneur kind of in name only. And so I don't think I thought of myself as like a founder for the longest time. I was just building products that seemed neat to me. And then suddenly one of them caught on, and now, I am a startup founder, but it wasn't because I was so desperate to do that. So sometimes the cart kind of gets in front of the horse, and I would just encourage people, it's so easy to build things now. If you're interested in software, just start building things. And the last thing I'll say is, don't build for a certain fad just because you're interested in that fad. And so, a couple years ago, everyone in the room probably would have been thinking about building in crypto, and now that's sort of dampened a little bit. Now it's all about AI, and AI is really exciting, and there's some things that I think everyone should be thinking about opportunities there. But that said, if you have a really cool idea outside of kind of the hype cycle, build for that. Build for something you're excited about. If it works out, you're going to do it for a decade or more. And so it should certainly be something that you're excited about and you would love even if it wasn't in the middle of a hype cycle.
Thank you. For the sake of time, before we move on to audience Q&A, I'd like to ask a few quick rapid-fire questions. Those will be fun questions, only need a short answer. So first off, have you ever struggled to get a bid for a party?
Yeah, I was rejected by DoorList once at UVA. It was very humbling.
What's your go-to party outfit?
Oh gosh, I have no style. I mean, just gym shorts, t-shirt, yeah.
What do you think is the best frat that's not debating?
Oh gosh. I don't know if I could pick. We have a lot of awesome users in a bunch of Greek life, non-Greek life organizations, and so an exciting thing's been actually seeing how many clubs are now on DoorList, and so I don't know that I'll pick. I'll pass on that one.
What song would immediately make you hit the dance floor?
Oh gosh, I don't do a lot of dancing. Gosh, I really like All I Do Is Win by DJ Khaled. Might date me a little bit.
If you had to choose one thing that makes or breaks a party, what would it be?
I would say definitely just there's a clear density or a critical mass of people where it actually doesn't matter beyond that. In some ways it gets worse, but it's very clear when there's kind of those open spaces. And so I'd say just the number of people who are there. It's not, it's kind of a shameless plug. It's one of the reasons that we hammer you guys with push notifications about events. It's we've realized that the satisfaction is a lot higher if people know what's going on and they actually show up. And so I'd say the number of people.
Thank you. Well, those are all the questions I have for you today. Let's give a round of applause for David. We'll now take a couple audience questions.
You mentioned AI. How has AI been used in the scripting of DoorList or writing code, or how could it be used as a feature maybe?
Yeah, we've tried. I mean, as much as I would love to be able to pitch it as an AI startup, I think our valuation would double the moment we could. It's a bit of a stretch. We certainly move a lot faster on the engineering side because of it. I mean, without a doubt, I do feel like we're getting done. We have 3 full-time engineers right now. I feel like we're getting done what 2 years ago, 5 or 6 people would have taken. And so that means our runway's longer, we can move even more quickly, which is awesome. So absolutely on the engineering side, you pointed out, that's a thing. You can actually generate event cover photos with AI. It is the most lightweight use of AI you can think of, and so I certainly wouldn't even think of it as a reason we'd be an AI company, but it is something we've actually seen pretty high engagement of. People seem to like it, and so that is the one open AI call in the entire app, is that you can create photos. Otherwise, we just use AI kind of internally to move as quickly as we can.
What was the process of building out your initial founding team, and what were those roles that were really critical in those early stages?
Yeah, gosh. So at UVA, I definitely had people kind of helping out part-time here and there. It wasn't until we raised money that we first hired people, and that was a big step. They're on the payroll, benefits, and so after that, Nia really imparted, it was really important to build a strong engineering core. We are a software company, and we try to move really quickly and try to be kind of at the frontier of our space. We ship to the App Store twice a week with meaningful changes, and that's a really important part of our DNA. And so first it was engineering talent and people we thought could move quickly and were excited about the problem space, but we also recognized that we did have a really fragmented space across a bunch of colleges. Our users are spread across thousands of colleges, and so we did kind of need a growth engine, and distribution was important. And so simultaneously we were building up a growth team, and they deal with go-to-market and our campus rep program and marketing and our paid ads, really everything except coding the app. And so we kind of did those in tandem. If you just have a growth team, then your product won't be there, and if you just have engineering, then you might need some distribution unless it truly grows on its own. And so we sort of tried to split it along the way.
Yeah, so I'm curious, especially at the beginning, before you had credibility and traction, what your journey was like trying to like find growth mechanisms and then like identify them so that you can push them. Like, were you going to fast like one by one, like, oh, user app, and then you kind of like call fire, or like?
Yeah, it's good. So when it first started, I think I sat down with 4 organizations at UVA, and so that was very much like a please, like, do me a favor, like, we'll upload your roster. I don't think we paid them, but I think it was very clear it was like a courtesy, like they would do it. And I think it was cool. Like, we onboarded those 4 that day, and I think by the end of day we had like 12 organizations at UVA, so it tripled. And then I think by the end of the week we had something like 30 organizations, and so that was a first indication. In figuring out what growth, metrics or what growth levers are working, in general, if something's worth your time in terms of really doubling down on it, it will be obvious. You cannot miss the signal, and so I had no anxiety that if something was working, I would miss on it. For example, like +1s felt somewhat effective, and then we saw that like the size of the app or the size of the user base was like doubling on a weekly basis for all these weeks, and most new users were coming from receiving a +1. It's like, okay, well that clearly is working, and there would be no way to possibly miss it. If something's a little better on the margins, it kind of doesn't matter. And so now we've gotten good at figuring out, A/B testing stuff and what's 2% more effective. In the early stages, there's a massive power law. You're going to find 1 or 2 things that are massively more successful than others, and you just have to like relentlessly pursue those ones.
Yeah, so as someone who's trying to build something myself, how important do you think these like technical skills are? And what did your like initial weeks of building look like?
Yeah, I think that I always tell people who aren't technical, the first thing you should do is find a technical co-founder, because I do think, we're talking about building software companies, and so it's really great to have someone on the founding team who understands software. And so I think that for me, I was a CS major. I wasn't at first I was not like a cracked engineer, like some of the Neo scholars or people that we interact with now. I was kind of just good enough to get it off the ground. And so you don't need to go find someone or be someone that's, a 10x engineer. It's actually okay if you're excited about building software and you're willing to really dive deep, unless it's something really deep tech, you can probably build at least an MVP of it. Almost anyone who's at all technical, and that was me. And so certainly the more technical you are, the more quickly you can build it. Speed is what's most important because speed results in iteration. And so early on, I just tried to get it in users' hands as fast as possible. It hurts because you feel like there's a chance that they might not like it, and you lose a lot of credibility because you release something that was half-baked. People are actually remarkably forgiving of that, and it's much better to have it in their hands and learn what's worth your time. It's really frustrating to invest time in a feature and then find out not only was it a waste of time, but you could have figured out that it would have been a waste of time just by releasing a little bit earlier. So I would just encourage you to release as early as possible, even if it feels embarrassing to. That's kind of the point.
Do you have any tips for young college entrepreneurs who are wanting to pitch to VCs and angel investors, and how to be taken seriously?
Yeah, it's tricky. I think that we were lucky. Our first real raise was via getting into the Neo Accelerator, and so it wasn't a typical process. We didn't go around. Our seed round was much more of a typical process. You take 30 meetings, you get way more no's than yeses, but all that matters are the yeses, and so our pre-seed, which was through the accelerator, we applied online, so it didn't matter. You didn't need a warm intro. I do think it is a business that's driven in a lot of ways by warm introductions and by your network, and so you shouldn't waste too much time at events and other things that are generally a waste of time. But to the degree that you can make some connections who will vouch for you, it's very rare to see a venture capital investment where there's not some sort of referral or social proof of somebody referring you to somebody else. And so all of our investors were introductions from previous investors or from people who really strongly believed in us. And so cultivating those relationships, it doesn't mean you have to go, buddy up with every VC in the Valley. You can also get really close with other startup founders who've been backed by other VCs. And that's actually a really strong introduction. I think our investors listen really hard when I send them a company because they know, like, we've seen firsthand, like, what kind of matters, what doesn't, maybe even more so than a VC would. And so I would focus on driving the connections. But more importantly, I wouldn't get so caught up in your ability to raise money. I think the best rounds happen because people are kind of kicking your door trying to invest in you. And that usually happens because you've just built a killer product. And so if you focus on product in a lot of ways, the venture capital thing will figure itself out.
Do you have a favorite lacrosse memory at UVA that still resonates with you today?
Yeah, we won the national championship in 2021, so that was cool. Yeah, number one. That was probably the coolest. And then, if you know, a cop out. That's sort of a cop out answer. Our season got canceled for COVID the season before, and we found out that basically, I think it was the NBA had just gotten canceled, the Big Ten had canceled, SEC, everyone but the ACC. And then the ACC, they said they were going to announce, but we knew if we went out to practice and like our coaches just turned off their phones, like they technically couldn't shut us down till they got the call. And so we all left our phones, coaches left everything in the locker room, we knew we'd get canceled, and we just had like a 4-hour scrimmage out on the field. And by the end, I mean, guys were limping off, like we knew the season was over, and sure enough, finally the AD came down and made us all scatter, and like, but that was definitely like a really cool experience. And then we went home for months, and so it was kind of crazy, but that was definitely one that, you know, sort of unconventional, but really cool. Yeah.
Are you hiring interns?
Good question, Rohan. Yeah, we're always hiring. Absolutely. So Rohan, what were you, last spring?
Yeah.
Yeah. The short answer is, like, if you are someone who's excited about the space, and you're someone who, like, we believe in it, and more importantly, actually, like, believes in us, like, we will make a role for you. We aren't actively hiring for spring interns because the spring sort of started. We've already hired an intern for the summer. We aren't actively seeking out anymore. But that said, you know, we've been referred some candidates that have made us really think hard about that. And so this isn't just for DoorList, but really for any startup. Like, I would just encourage you to reach out. Most roles at startups, or even, you know, big startups, most roles are not listed online anywhere. And so don't be afraid to just reach out. We've had some really strong employees who have just, you know, reached out cold, or interns who've reached out cold. And so if it's interesting to you, like, please, my email is just david@doorlist.app. Like, please reach out. We'll talk to you. We'll figure out if it might be a fit. And so I appreciate you asking that, Rohan. Like, we're absolutely always hiring, specifically if you're really interested in the social space. We want people who have a really strong product sense, and feel like someone who really is going to actually not just learn a bunch, but help us take the product to the next level.
Alright, so we try to that'll be the last question tonight, but thank you for that incredibly insightful conversation, and to our audience for all of your questions. Good one, a round of applause.